And I think that I would like to lean on Brian as an introductory resource to provide a more scientific context for what we understand in regards to guilt and shame. One thing that I thought was interesting in some of my studying this week was just that in human development, when young children, babies, toddlers, and Brian and Spencer can probably speak more anecdotally to this than I can, but guilt and shame is not really a conscious emotion in the early stages. That it is not that a newborn baby, you don't see shame or guilt. I don't know when the timing is, supposedly when we've tried to pinpoint the emergence of shame and guilt, or an awareness of guilt. But I think it would be good to talk a little bit about what we know about the emotion, some explanations that we've explored in the world, and then see what it might have to do with what we're experiencing now, and then go from there.
Awesome.
Yeah. Jordan, any thoughts before I jump into the history?
Yeah, no, that's what I was gonna ask you to jump into the history, because I think perhaps it began with, and you'll probably go into this, somewhat of a survival instinct. And to Zach's point, from what I understand, children are quite narcissistic up until at least age 4. So, and
Speak for yourself.
Continue that. So,
Yeah.
I'll let you jump into it, Brian.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's fairly consensus among experts that humanity, the human race evolved for hundreds of thousands of years in kind of hunter-gatherer tribes limited by Dunbar's number, which is 150 people roughly. If you don't know what that is, go Wikipedia the trash out of that. Some great information there. But essentially, farming didn't exist until about 12,000 years ago, as experts believe it today. And prior to that, people lived in these kind of small tribes, right, of a few, extended families, a few families, and they had to be mobile, right, for gathering various to be able to subsistence, feed themselves and whatnot. So living in such a tight-knit community, in a tight-knit, everybody kind of had a purpose, everybody had a responsibility, and shame and guilt were essentially survival mechanisms for these groups, as in kind of in the hunter-gatherer mindset. If one person doesn't uphold their job or do their job, that means their sister or their cousin or their second cousin dies because they didn't do what they needed to. So they, essentially, shame and guilt, arose out of a necessity to make sure that there was group cohesion and that everybody was focused on the good of the whole rather than the good of the individual. I sent out a link. I don't know if you guys looked at a couple of those articles in the Google Doc, but one of the comments was talking about how I think the comment was that the fact that the same pattern is encountered in such mutually remote communities suggests that shame's matched audience evaluation is a design feature crafted by natural selection. So, I'm curious, were there hunter-gatherer tribes that just didn't have shame as a survival mechanism and they just died off because people did the wrong stuff? I'm curious as to that, but yeah, so that's so there. I mean, there is a very strong purpose for shame and for guilt to make sure that individuals are not making decisions that are going to be detrimental to themselves or to others around them. So that's kind of the basics there.
Don't we see it also in certain animals? I mean, they can reject or even exile their own if they're not pulling their weight, so to speak. From what I've seen on, Blue Planet or Planet Earth.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So
Zach,
I think it's a natural tendency.
Zach, you had
Zach,
something?
did you have something?
Well, I was thinking, because I mean, we're not experts, and Brian is still very, I think, has definitely studied this a lot more than I have, and I'm glad that he was able to provide that context, and hopefully he'll continue to do so. I think I'm interested also in, trying to imagine or understand some of the mechanisms in play, because I think, as Spencer said, we're going to probably move on to how guilt and shame have been leveraged inappropriately, and trying to have a healthier approach towards guilt and shame. Understanding it like any other human emotion. We may not understand how it became a part of our nature, or how it was first leveraged as a part of nurture, and how that combination has created a lot of what Brian said were marked similarities across tribes that had no communication with each other whatsoever. So that it is human to have shame and guilt, and maybe in other species like Jordan. I think some of my biggest burning questions is, why do we feel shame? How much of it is learned, and how much of it is self-inflicted, especially when we talk about guilt and whatever different social mores there are in the world.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, but I also think that in these early times, I feel like guilt is a natural result of a poor decision. Guilt is a natural result of a poor decision. So in these hunter-gatherer societies long ago, like if you don't take care of your family, you feel guilty. Or if you don't fulfill responsibility, you feel guilty. I think that shame is the thing that they used guilt as a weapon against that particular person.
Okay.
So I think like at some point,
Right.
like shame is like the bludgeon to say you feel guilty. See, now that means you're bad. Like, or in some way they used a natural response
Tendency,
to making
yeah.
a poor decision to as a weapon.
Or you could define it probably as an internal feeling that is guilt, and then it becomes an external source of whether or not you're worthy of
Mhm.
love or worthy of acceptance. I heard a definition today, I think it was Russell Brand, that was saying that shame is essentially the feeling you feel when you don't feel worthy of other people's connection or worth or love. So yeah, and
go ahead.
that would make sense in that context with the hunter-gatherer.
Go ahead, Bri.
Yeah. So a couple thoughts. So, in my MBA program, we talked a lot about Carol Dweck, her research. She's famous for having developed this what's called fixed versus growth mindset, and how that's used in parenting. So, how frequently do we hear parents say, "Oh man, you're the best artist I've ever seen," talking to a little son or daughter, or "Wow, you were so good at that." So I think from we're just ignorant to our actions and what we are ingraining in our children from a young age, that they either are good or are not good, right? That things are either born with you or not. And she talks about growth mindset, and how it's much more important to focus on, wow, you worked so hard, right? You're praising work ethic in the process. To Zach's question though, how do we develop shame, and how does guilt, how does it come about outside of a religious context, but more in a cultural or a societal context? The wonderful democracy that we live in, essentially we're being marketed to at every turn. And the best way for companies to market to individuals is to tell them you're not good enough, but you will be with our makeup, right? You're going to attract all these guys or whatever. So I think a lot of the marketing around us and the message from society and from companies that are trying to increase their revenue is just, hey, your life sucks, but with our product or service, it's going to be a whole lot better. So I do think that plays a part in it, which, good and bad, pros
Yeah, I
and
was
cons.
listening to a video video by Brene Brown this morning, and she completely was saying stuff along those lines, saying that shame comes in two different flavors, I guess. When we seek to aspire to something, one element of shame is, but think of every bad thing you've done. Like, how can you accomplish this thing? Look at all these mistakes that you've made in the past that disqualify you from being able to move forward. And then the second one is similar, but she did a better job of explaining how distinct it is. It was something along the lines of, who do you think you are? Like, why of all people would you be the one who could be successful in this endeavor? So like feelings of coming up short, maybe not having it in you, is, I guess, a form of shame. And just like Brian said, we see a lot of marketing that I think either goes and takes on that negative side of, if you don't use this product, then you won't be enough, or the rah, you are more than enough no matter what, which I still think also misses the mark maybe on the other side, because it goes along with what Brian said earlier, where you have like a child and you're like, oh my gosh, that's so good, you're the best artist ever, when objectively they're not.
Right.
And so maybe, focusing more on the effort and the value of trying something, and not, just sitting there and watching the world go past you, and not being intimidated by how big the world is.